Right. This is a follow-on from yesterday's story. It's amazing how things at a distance, a number of years apart, slowly fit together. Now, yesterday I told you about how I managed to encourage my pals in Sandy Hills to dig my garden because they were going to be German prisoners and were going to be held prisoner in my Anderson shelter in the garden. Well, what happened was where our garden was located roughly in the bottom of a valley between Tollcross and Shettleston. Very steep hills, or fairly steep hills on one side, and a fairly light hill gradually coming down into the valley from Shettleston. What happened was we had very, very heavy rain, and a burn ran through the bottom of the valley. It ran by Little's house, and their garden was only about 8 feet away from the burn, or streamlet as it might have been called elsewhere. So there was very, very heavy rain. Sandy Hills was very sandy soil and rained quickly under normal circumstances. The burn rose quite considerably, and there was an air raid. And Little and his mother, for his father was in a night shift in Stuart and Lloyd's, Little and his mother went into the shelter only to find that they were flooded up to their waist in water. Now, it was a bit like between the devil and the deep blue sea. They had a fear of going out because of the bombing. They also had a fear of drowning, and the water was cold, no central heating in that shelter. So anyway, they stayed all night in it until they heard the all clear sound, which are sirens that were sounded to let you know that the raid was over. Came out, and of course obviously dealt with whatever the situation was. Went back into the house, absolutely soaking wet, and really feeling very, very shocked. In the morning, or well, probably late afternoon, Little told us all about it. We went round and we saw this terribly flooded Anderson shelter, water really up to the edge of the door. Now bear in mind that was water that would be about 4 foot deep, and Jim wasn't all that big. Sorry, Little was not that big, so he was in fact just probably managed to keep his head above water, as they would say. Anyway, it interested us all because, all being of a very scientific mind, we as children thought, this is marvellous. Well, not when you're standing in it. But anyway, as our minds developed, we in fact analysed it, and eventually I thought, this is a good idea. So went round to our garden again. Prisoners were no longer prisoners, but they climbed into the Anderson shelter, and we told them they were in a submarine. Well, it was a motorboat to start with, but eventually we developed into a submarine, and every so often we would consider that we were underwater and, carry on conversations, and we were going to torpedo something, and it was good fun. But then we sprung a leak. Now what I'd done is actually taken a pail of water into the Anderson shelter and some tin cans, probably Heinz beans tins and such like, and we kept on throwing out a cup of water every so often. This was us bailing out. Now my mother saw that from the back door, didn't think very much of it, but a day or two later, probably as a result of the flooding of Little's shelter near the burn, people came round asking where was our Anderson shelter flooding. My mother says, well, I don't know about that, but I did see the boys bailing out water. So that was it. Our name was put down as a shelter that was flooding. Now, some of the gardens above us had no problem at all, for they were well above the water table, but we potentially were in the water table, but not getting water into the shelter. Anyway, in due course, council men came along, dug up part of the garden, put in drainage pipes and a drain into the bottom of our Anderson shelter. It was all done very quickly and very neatly. And next time there was use of the shelter, we found that we had about a foot of water in our shelter. Now, our scientific mind went to work again, and what we realised that with these drains going in, and obviously given a very accessible way for any water coming down from the hill into these drains, they immediately would run it straight into our shelter and other shelters that would probably have been treated in a similar manner. So that was it. It just shows you the consequence of, very clever examination on our part as where the water came from. Well, it was after it happened, we knew. But Jim's case, it was very noticeable that because of where the shelter was located, and there was no other location it could have been in, it in fact alerted us to what would be a very good game, but a rather silly outcome for our house at 48 Gilmerton Street. And that's the end of that story, but it just shows you, what seems an interesting thing at the start can be really a quite enormously problem. Now, what we eventually did do, we dug down, took the drain out, this is my dad done this, and we blocked the drain with clay, which acted as a plug. It was just like big lumps of plasticine being shoved up the pipe, and we had no further flooding. The shelter was, of course, at a later date used as part of the foundation for my dad's hen house. The hens didn't roost in the shelter, thank goodness, because if we ever had to use it, it would have been a pretty messy situation. But raids kind of slowed down at that point, and we got used to the idea of hearing the air raid siren, and a little while later popping out. We saw no searchlights in the sky because none of the planes seemed to be, German planes seemed to be, in fact, in our area. And that was it. So that's the end of that story. Thank you.